here. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time, setting each of them up, because each of them is social media savvy. And by that I mean that they actually have websites and other things where you can find the basic demographic information on each of them available, and you can find it in all kinds of different media formats. But I want to give a little bit of a background for why we are at this panel and what we're talking about. And one of the things that motivated the team to put together this panel was actually a piece of Sophie Blackall's art that many of you may have seen on the New York City public subways. And it was a piece of art that just was a wonderful piece, as are many of the art in motion pieces on the New York City public subways. Wow, I'm really nervous. Sorry about that. And it was just a really wonderful thing. But one of the things that I loved about it was some of the response that it received in the social media. Oh, did you see me? You must have been drawing me when I was on the subway. And there were a couple of really interesting responses. And it goes back to the fact, and looking at the work that has been done over time, particularly that of Masha Rudman, Windows, Mirrors, and Doors, and how incredibly important it is for all of us to be able to see and connect. And when we look and see ourselves in literature, we're not always seeing the visual. We may be seeing something. We may be seeing talent develop. Maybe seeing a relationship or something else like that. So I'm really delighted to have all of them. And here we have a couple of the obligatory slides that highlight who they are and the fact that they are social media savvy. And we're looking at all those kinds of things like that. I also want to point out that although both Daniel and Sophie have actually done and created adult books, Sophie's being Misconnections, which was the misconnections that we have in love, life, and the pursuit of happiness, whatever way you define happiness, and that Daniel has been working on a number of adult books, and he has Midnight Taxi Tango coming out in 2016.
January.
Okay, so January of 2016. So we're going to talk a little bit about those kinds of things and other kinds of things like that. I've also put together some images from each of their books and or images that will help you connect to the different ones. And while I prepared them somewhat for this panel, I also want to encourage you to communicate and respond to each other in an appropriate format so that we can share and see the many different diverse perspectives that are out there about our reaction to all kinds of different literature. And it was so lovely to start off the morning this morning with Alfred Tatum from Illinois talking about the diversity in literature and this whole idea of textual narratives, or how we create textual lineages. And for the panelists, he talked a little bit about the fact that throughout our lives, the books that we pick up influence who we are and what we do, but they have a different level of impact and other things like that. So, very quickly, would each of you respond to this question, which is, could you tell us a little bit about your latest project and give the audience a little bit of a snippet, or, as I like to say, your elevator pitch, or here at CitiField, your baseball pitch, for why they might be interested in reading your book. Sean, would you mind starting with you?
Sure. So my latest book, I have two, actually three, but
feel free to pick.
Those are two of them. So Emmanuel's Dream and The Case for Loving, they're both nonfiction. One is about a boy who grew up in Ghana. He was born disabled. His right leg was misformed or deformed, and his mother decided to raise him like she would any other kid, and his father walked out on him. And that's kind of common, or that was kind of common at the time. I think it took place in the 80s. And so he learned how to run and hop and crawl and do all these other things, just like anyone else would. And I believe it was like around the age of 6, his mother was carrying him to school 2 miles. And she said, you know what, you're too heavy, you're gonna have to do it on your own. So he would hop on one leg to school and back. So when his mother passed away, he made a vow to her to do something with his life and never to be a beggar. Because there were a lot of disabled in Ghana who were beggars. So he had already learned how to ride a bike with one leg, and he had the brainstorm that he was going to actually bike all around Ghana, all across the country, and become an advocate for the disabled. showing them that someone who is disabled can do something that people didn't think they were able to do. And it's a really incredible story, and I was really honored to be able to illustrate it. And then the second book is The Case for Loving, which was written by my wife, Selena Alco, and we collaborated on the illustrations.
And she is featured on the Brooklyn or New York City Reads 365 poster.
Oh, yeah.
Because B is for Brooklyn. She
Yes.
is the creator of that particular book.
And Julie Loving is also one of the librarians.
Oh my goodness, I didn't know that.
Oh.
You know, I've met some other people from the Loving family, just sort of haphazardly.
Wow.
That's great. So if you don't know the story, it's about Richard and Mildred Loving. They were an interracial couple who had to fight to have their marriage recognized in the state of Virginia in the 50s and 60s. It was not honored, so they went to Washington, D.C., got married, and they went back to live in Virginia and got imprisoned. And then later, two lawyers from New York offered their expertise to help them take their court case to the Supreme Court, where they won. So, I mean, without trying, they changed the world. Yeah.
And Sophie, you want to talk about one of your latest projects?
Oh, thank you. So if we're talking about books that are already out, I have a book out this month called Finding Winnie, which is the true story of the real bear that inspired Winnie the Pooh, which I did not bring. Written by the great-granddaughter of Captain Harry Colborne, who was a Canadian soldier who found an orphaned black bear cub on a train station platform on his way to World War I. He adopted the bear, she became the mascot of the troops. The two were inseparable. When it came time to go into battle, he couldn't stand to leave her behind, so he took her with him. Eventually, when it was really war, he had to leave her at the London Zoo with deep regret, but she became the most beloved bear, the most beloved animal, I think, in the zoo for all that time, and the friend of Christopher Robin, the son of A.A. Milne, who would go on to write the stories we all know so well, Winnie the Pooh. The bear's name was Winnie after Winnipeg, which is where Captain Harry Colborne came from, and the story is written by his great-granddaughter. So there's a whole lot of ephemera at the back of the book, his diary photographs. So that was a really fun project to work on, and that book is just out, and I don't have it. You can imagine it. I told you all about it. You pretty much got it.
It's Googleable.
And it's Googleable. And the other one is a fine dessert, which Susannah is holding up here, which is traces the making of a dessert called blackberry fool, which is the one of the oldest desserts in the Western world. It's blackberries, cream, and sugar. We followed the making of the dessert over 4 centuries and 4 different families. In 1710, it's a mother and daughter in Lyme, England. In 1810, it's an enslaved mother and daughter in South Carolina. In 1910, it's a mother and daughter in Boston, and 2010, it's a father and son in San Diego. The book follows all sorts of things in a fairly simple, at first appearance, text. It follows the history of food technology, it follows the history of women's role in the kitchen, and it follows what we thought was one of the most important parts of American history, which is the inclusion of an enslaved mother and daughter. It resolves in the end, if it's perhaps not a resolution, but it's an optimistic inclusion of as many kinds of people as we could hopefully put together in a joyous celebration of community and food. Well, you can see, my friends are all in that picture. I live in Brooklyn, and I'm fortunate enough that we live in such a diverse community, but this actually takes place in San Diego. So there was a phenomenal amount of research in this book, to the point where in this picture, the little boy is chasing a firefly, which to me was the most joyous, childlike experience I can imagine. Coming from Australia, we don't have fireflies. They're a huge novelty to me, and my children were just so enamored of them, as was I. So because this child is a symbol of the child in 1810 who was in the dinner scene, he is pulling a rope which fans the family. It's an incredibly provocative and, to me, unsettling image, one which children respond to viscerally. So I wanted to include a small child of approximately the same age and approximately the same color in an attitude of playfulness and fun and childhood. As I said, and I'm talking way too much, and I'll maybe get a word in a second. I went into so much deep research with this book, which was such a joyous, fun, and wonderful experience for me. But I was just mortified at one point. I've been mortified many times since, but I was mortified at one point when somebody told me there are no fireflies in California. And I was just, how could I have overlooked that? And somebody then, because the internet is what it is, and people can respond and tell you all the things that they see, somebody had seen a website called Firefly Tracker. And on this website, you can see where fireflies are, and it's been documented by people all across the country dating back for the last 20 years. I was able to see that in 2010, there was one firefly in California, and I believe this is the firefly.
Daniel, I love it because you have such strong adult work and other things. If you wouldn't mind talking about your first debut in the young adult world, which is getting a lot of fanfare, which is an amazing story, but if you would also possibly give a slight pitch for your forthcoming book as well.
Happily.
Let's get it all balanced and
Sure.
everything. So.
My name is Daniel José Older. Shadow Shaper is my book. It's my first YA book. It's actually the first book that I ever sat down to write. It took longer to come out than some of the stuff I was writing for adults. But basically, it comes from that kind of...
I'm winning.
Thank you both. But yes, it comes from that sort of time memorial question of what would happen if Harry Potter met The Wire. And I was thinking a lot about how we represent cities in America and how we think about magic and fantasy and representation. And I was loving Harry Potter, and I was not seeing myself in Harry Potter. And I was looking back on all the fantasy and sci-fi that I had taken in as a child and never had really truly seen myself. And I was working with a lot of young folks in Bushwick and all over Brooklyn who were, not connecting to fantasy and sci-fi, but also loving fantasy and sci-fi. And so it's a lot of it is sort of about asking that question, how do you love a genre that doesn't love you back? And then how do you respond to it lovingly and also with a critique? And Shadow Shaper was from that question of, can we also look at the city, which doesn't always love us back, and think about it in a loving way too, but also show it for all its flaws. So, it's about being honest about gentrification and honest about street harassment and all these levels of things, and patriarchy, within Sierra's particular community. So it's really about doing all that and also telling a magical, fun story where there's dragons and flying and murals coming to life and all kinds of other things. Because I think we can have all that. I don't think we have to separate the idea of, there's this sort of artificial separation we do of issues books and then everything else, right? And it's like, well, no, like people deal with issues, and we sometimes have to, fight dragons and do magical things, or have the dragons fight on our side in some cases. So it's a lot about that, and it's a lot about just telling a great story and, thinking about Brooklyn in a loving way and all these other things. And basically, Sierra finds out that she's connected to this legacy of shadow shapers who are sorcerers who figure out how to bring works of art to life by imbuing them with spirits. And so she takes on this legacy, which she's also been excluded from, and then she has to save, and it's about her journey.
Right. And do you want to give a little bit of a pitch for
Yes.
your forthcoming Midnight Taxi Tango?
Midnight
There's
Taxi
a lot of
Tango.
alliteration there.
Yes, Midnight Taxi Tango is the sequel to Half Resurrection Blues, which is my first adult novel, which also takes place in an adjacent community in magical Brooklyn with ghosts and creatures running around. I mean, basically, these characters get to have more sex because it's adult, right? It's a joke. Right? It has lots of sex, obviously. More graphics. Anyway, so it's about ghosts, and it's about this cult of cockroach creature men that run around stealing people. It's really scary, and it's about these different characters who all intersect around trying to save each other's lives, essentially. But it's also about grieving, because each of the three point of view characters is going through some form of loss at the beginning of the book, and they're all managing that as they battle evil cockroach dudes. Because there's layers.
There's a lot to be talking about these days and other things, and one of the things that we know is that as a result of this campaign, which we all support in other things, the We Need Diverse Books campaign, and if you haven't regularly and you don't regularly check this website, it is a wealth of absolutely incredible resources on all kinds of diversities, windows, mirrors, and doors for all of us and other things. But as a result of that, and as a result of many of the conversations that have been in the mass media for all kinds of things, and the development of the Reading While White blog and other types of things, that we're all grappling with how we deal with diversity. And so my question to all of you is, how do we keep driving the conversation, and how do we deal with diversity? And what are insights that you have, advice, and other things like that as we've dealt with different types of things? And you've all been in the thick of it in many different ways, let's just say in many different ways, and have experiences and evolutions. Does anybody would like to start off with how we deal with diversity? And I know, Sean, you're working on some forthcoming projects also about multiple different types of diversities and other things like that. And Sophie, you've always put diverse characters into your images and the works that you've done since the very beginning of when you came to the United States from Australia. And Daniel, what's so fabulous is how you talk about diversities in so many different realms, whether it's the musical realm, Daniel's quite a musical guy as well, and other things, or whether it's the life or how we see ourselves. So does anybody want to tackle this complex, multi-layered question?
10 words or less.
That's what my students have to do tonight, but I'll give you a little bit more than 10 words. Sean, could we start with you?
I just saw it.
Okay.
He's looking all despondent.
Okay.
I'm hoping to have friends like.
I'm just going to freestyle.
Okay, freestyle. Just bring it.
You know, it's such a big subject, and
It is a big subject.
I'm so happy to be here talking about it because I think about it a lot. I've lived it my entire life. I've been the only brown guy in the room so many times. There's just so much to say. One of the biggest, I applaud all the editors who buy these interesting manuscripts about diversity, and all the publishers who put them out. And there's just so many different ways of looking at it. One of the conversations, and this is sort of off topic, but it's on topic, we have in my house, is Woody Allen versus Larry David. So I'm the Larry David guy, and I realize this is a bigger topic, but my wife's the Woody Allen guy, and I find it really hard to watch Woody Allen movies. And part of the reason why is I feel like everything he had interesting to say he said maybe 30 some years ago, and he's just continuing that conversation with the same characters. And it's very frustrating to me. Similar thing with Wes Anderson. Can't watch his films as beautiful as they are. I feel that I have this visceral response when I see the absence of people of color in them. You know, it's like this beautiful world of misfits, and they're all the same complexion. I just find it absurd and insulting, quite honestly. So Larry David, Curb Your Enthusiasm, I love that show. He finds a way to weave everything into it, everything. I remember one of the first times Wanda Sykes was on there, she's screaming at Larry David. She's like, "Why aren't there any black people on your shows?" And Larry's just like in shock. Well, what better way to address the conversation about diversity than write it into your script? I mean, you know, that to me is powerful. You know, after Hurricane Katrina, he had a family from New Orleans come live with him. You know, in classic Larry David way. He's like, "Oh, you're the blacks." That would be like, you know, if my last name was Jew. I mean, like he's having the conversation about diversity in his own way, and I really applaud him for it. I find it inspiring. You know, people, Muslims, women, people in wheelchairs. He throws it all in there, and it's just part of his life, and it's part of all of our lives. And I think, it just requires one to be honest in what they, whether you're writing fantasy or, nonfiction picture books or, whatever. It's just that level of honesty is attractive to everyone, I truly believe. And I just don't think we're there yet, and I don't know why. I don't know why, and like I said, I get really frustrated, especially around Wes Anderson films. I'm like, why aren't you seeing this? Just. I'm glad you get it. It's
I get it.
Like this
I
whole
think
missing
that'd be bonkers.
element. It's like this beautiful world, but it's not. Granted, it's sort of like a fantastical representation of reality, but for me, it's a slap in the face. And yeah. I don't know what.
And there's a huge diversity of whiteness within the movie, right? And that's what's so like, wow, white people get to be all these different things,
Right.
but we don't even show up, and that's sort of striking.
Danny
Yeah.
Glover was there once.
Right.
Indian people seem to be servants all the time.
Yeah.
That's not diversity for me. Yeah, and it's easier for me to talk about film and television this way and not point fingers in picture books. Because I think picture books are more aware of it. Yeah, maybe.
You look like you're ready to go, and then I'll.
All right. So I almost didn't do this panel. I'm gonna talk about A Fine Dessert. I want it to be clear that this isn't a personal attack. I'm a big fan of your work, especially now that I've seen the Subway piece, which I've been admiring for years. I love it. And I believe, especially now having met you, but I certainly believe, and I always have from your comments, that you came from a very genuine place writing this book, drawing the pictures for this book. That was never in doubt for me. And yes, and I tell my students that we have to try knowing that we're going to fail, and I believe in that. And as writers and artists, our intentions become irrelevant once we put our work out into the world. And a book is a creation of a village, just like people are. And so it's really about the whole community of Kidlit that needs to be having this conversation, and is having this conversation, that we need to address. I don't think it's just about your drawings as much as it is about your drawings. It's also about how they're received, and who decided to publish them, and all these different ways that we talk about them. My reaction to the book was visceral and painful. Slavery is an open wound in America because we have been lying to ourselves about it forever, and we continue to today. And I think you really didn't want to continue that lie, and I think the book does. And you've asked people to read the full book and look at the context of it, and I know that you put in the serious faces at the last panel of that sequence. With the idea of bringing some of the drama of slavery to light and the tragedy of it. For me, that didn't do it at all. I think when we show enslaved children doing slave work with a smile, it takes a lot more than a frown later on to really contextualize it properly. For me, the context of this book is the wildly undiverse children's book publishing world. It's the ongoing cycle of violence against children of color that is committed by the state. It is that the Confederate flag still flies until there's a massacre to bring it down. It is that we are still fighting the Civil War in many, many ways, and we're still dealing with the fallout of slavery in many ways. People of color don't have the luxury of being able to sugarcoat history to our children. And when we do, people die. And that's one of the really important pieces about this, that we are traumatized, and it is an ongoing state of emergency for people of color in America today. And children's books need to speak to that without trying to provide umbrellas or make it sound like everything's okay, because it's not. The role of literature is to tell us the difficult truths, which again I believe you tried to do, but to arm us for the world in all of its ugliness. And that's not an easy thing to do in a children's book. And I think that there's a lot of honesty in the end when the writer says that they know that you guys knew that you were going to bring up an issue that you couldn't fully take in the whole birth of. And from my point of view, where I stand. If you can't, then you shouldn't touch it. That's how I feel about slavery. That's how I feel about sexual assault. There's some things that we can't sugarcoat. So I want to say that because I think that we're all trying to figure out how to do diversity right, and that's going to always come with times when we do it wrong. I don't think anyone should be patting themselves on the back for starting this conversation. I don't think you are. I don't think anyone should be, because I think it's a very unhealthy conversation for us to be having right now in America. I think we should be past it. I don't think we should be wondering whether or not it's okay to make it look like slavery may or may not have been not that bad. I think on a diversity panel we should be talking about strategies for moving forward and for getting free, but we're not. So that's why I almost didn't come. I'm glad I came. I'm glad that we've met and we get to have this conversation. And I hope we get to continue the conversation, but I also don't, because I don't think it's a great conversation. I think it's a really painful conversation, and I want us to move forward from it. So.
Sure, and then just wave at me when I've been talking
Okay.
for too long, and
Okay.
feel free to wave at
I'm
me.
not gonna wave at
Thank you, Daniel, for your thoughtful comments, and I too am very glad we met. And could I just have a sort of show of hands of who is aware of the
What's going on
controversy
with
surrounding a fine dessert this week? Okay, so about half of you. So just to recap quickly, I mean, Daniel did do it quite well there, that there are all sorts of different responses to this book which seem to have erupted over the last 2 weeks. The book has been out since January. I've taken this book into numerous very diverse schools all across the country and have had a really extraordinary response from children in the moment, reading the book, engaging with the book, the conversations that we have had surrounding the issues in this book, an amazing response from teachers and parents after the event who have gone home and shared the book with their children. So I've heard a lot of very positive feedback to this book. But in the last week, I think perhaps because it was talked about in the context of the Caldecott Award, as many books are being, it came to a lot more people's attention, and so the conversation has widened.
And you can read more about this on Caldecott or Reading
All
While
over the
White
place.
or Deb Reese's American Indian and Children's Literature blog or other places. So you can explore all the dimensions of this particular topic in whatever way that is appropriate for you and your audiences.
So I have so appreciated this conversation, and I have been listening to as many different points of view as I can. My point of view is in the illustrations. The book exists. Reading pictures is a very complicated, subjective thing. I cannot ensure that my pictures are read the way I intended them. I can only approach each illustration with as much thoughtfulness and research and empathy as I can muster, and that's what I genuinely, sincerely tried to do with this book. The arguments and the criticisms have been diverse. There are some people who wish slavery was not in a book for these young children. They think it is too complicated and painful a subject for very young children to encounter. There are some people who think, as I believe Daniel does, that it sugarcoats or whitewashes the issue of slavery, that it doesn't go far enough, that it shows slavery as perhaps something that might have been fun or pleasurable. And those ideas are very painful for me to hear, because that is abhorrent to me, the idea that we might have produced something that some people could possibly read as being fun or pleasurable. The narrative which I have objected to, which has spread around the internet, is that I have shown smiling slaves having fun while they're working. And I don't truly believe that. Not only do I not believe this is not what I intended, clearly, I don't believe this is what I have shown. Thank you for... and this is certainly not the response I'm getting from children when they read the book. They have a visceral response. They have so many questions, and we talk about this, and teachers have told me that they talk about it too, and so have parents. So I appreciate so much that there are these different conversations, but the consensus and really that I'm hearing is that there is no consensus, that there can be coexisting different views, and that even African American people, even descendants of slaves, can have opposing and different views. And there are those blog posts that exist, and you can read about them too. Varian Johnson wrote just this morning, he is an African American writer, he has 2 daughters, picture book age, and he is from South Carolina, and he's the descendant of slaves. And he wrote initially that he had read this book with his daughters, that he loved the book. Then he read about the controversy, and he needed to go back and look at it again. And he did look at it again, and he ultimately decided that it works for him. He thinks it's a book that needs conversation, and he thinks that there are many layers, and he can understand why some people see it in many different ways, but it works for him. And I think that's all, I mean, I would say many things, but I think that's one of the things that I would say is I would never want everybody to read every book I make. I would want them to read it if they wanted to read it. I'm not forcing anybody to read this book. I am interested and intrigued and want to learn from many different opinions and responses to it. I think I'm loving that we are having this conversation, and thank you all for coming, and I'm so full of admiration for everything that you do in the classroom and with your students, and how much you care about books, and the fact that you're here is all, speaks volumes. So I would hope that no teacher gives any class one book that touches on slavery. I would hope that they read many, many different points of view on it. And I think what this book tries to do, which most books on the subject of slavery don't, is it tries to tackle it in the wider context of a sweeping history, not a comprehensive history, because we could only choose 4 families in 400 years. So it is a very particular story of these individual 4 families. But it tries to put it in that context so that when I read this in a classroom, a diverse classroom where there are black kids and white kids, they look at these pictures, and then they look at each other, and then they look at the pictures again, and then they get to the end of the book, which hopefully is a more representative picture of their lives, but they can see this other really important part of our history in that context. And I think that has been a very important part of the book.
I think a couple of things that we have to put on the table are really important. A long time ago, my doctoral advisor said to me, insert certain people at certain times under certain circumstances. And for a lot of us, I think those are variables that we have to take into account. One of the things I particularly love about Daniel's young adult novel, which I will have to admit, I had to really submerge myself in this world, but I love the strengths that come out of this novel. And I love the fact that, honestly, I will admit that it helped me to appreciate a part of fantasy, general fantasy period, besides the fact that I had to look up a couple of things. But it helped me appreciate a part of fantasy, which goes back to the fact that many of you may recall that after 9/11, the largest spike in reading habits in this country that was documented through the public and school libraries was fantasy reading. It wasn't actually about what had happened or getting to know the potential players and other things like that. And I think a lot of the things that you're doing in this particular novel really start to push boundaries in a way so that we can be reflective in different ways. And in thinking about that, I would like to actually pitch something to Sean, unless you want to have something to say, which I am happy for you to say, and I noticed the microphone.
No, okay.
I want to pitch something to Sean because there's a change between the first printing and the second printing of this particular book. And thank you very much for Scholastic for making sure that I had a visual copy, because I don't collect every printing of every book. I love you all, but I will not have 47 printings of all of your books.
And forget you.
Exactly. So, Sean, do you want to talk a little bit about what happened as a result from the first to the second printing of this book? And I do have I actually have the physical, if that's useful to you. But would you talk a little bit about what happened when you and Selena were doing the work for this book, and then some clarifications that my understanding is that you totally supported when it was brought to your attention?
So, part of what happened is there's a page.
Do you mind if I go straight to that page?
So, it's.
The original is on the bottom, and the new one, the second printing is on the top.
Okay. It's a description of Mildred and Richard. Richard Loving was a good, caring man. He didn't see differences. There was one person Richard loved more than the rest. Mildred Jeter was part African American, part Cherokee. But what most folks in Central Point knew this was how thin she was.
Totally jealous.
That's how she got the nickname. String Beat was changed to Richard Loving was a tall, quiet man with fair skin and broad shoulders. The person he loved most was Mildred Jeter. Mildred was part African American, part Native American, and she was thin as a rail. That's how she got the name String Beat.
Research is complicated.
Yeah,
And in researching this particular book and looking and even having some of my law friends look at it, they were like, well, some things say she was Cherokee, some things say she wasn't, some things say her birth certificate said this, and there was just a lot of information out there.
Right, and I think, is it Deborah?
Debbie Reese,
Debbie Reese.
who many of you may follow along on her blog.
Really brought issue with the Cherokee description of Mildred, and I've spoken to at least some family members of hers, and no one seems to really know whether she was Cherokee, Rappahannock, and then I think there are some. I think Deborah Reese may have said, or somewhere I read that Mildred claimed to not have any African American heritage. But then I've also read that the Rappahannock Nation is less likely to recognize someone as Rappahannock if they claim any African American heritage. We're also talking about the 1950s and the 1960s, where it may have been convenient for someone to claim that they had no African American heritage. James Brown, of all people, claimed he was part Japanese, part Native American, and had no African American heritage.
James Brown.
So it's extremely loaded, and yeah, you know, I really don't know what to say about it, and that, you know, it comes down to one's intention and you know, in trying to represent diversity. And the fact is, no one really knows what her background was. I believe that she was part African American. I mean, just my gut tells me she looks that way, she feels that way when I see her, when I see videos of her. So yeah, that became a little bit of a controversy, and it was very disturbing to my wife, who's Canadian of origin, and the fact that you're Australian. You know, it's very interesting. There are two people that I know that include, and they always have included, African Americans in their artwork. You know, without question, it's like, oh yeah, you know, and that means that's really important, I think. To speak on, you know, fine dessert, there's a lot to be said. It's not a book about slavery. For me, it's not a book about slavery. It's about fine dessert. And it's about the bonding that takes place between mother and child throughout the book. It's about the process of making something with your hands. I've done a few books about slavery, and I can tell you some of the comments I've gotten. I'd rather not buy your book because your children aren't happy. I've heard this over and over again. Over and over again. So, you know, I'm like, yeah, because they were slaves. You know, and there are times in Freedom Song, the story about Henry Box Brown, he smiles, you know. He smiles when he met the love of his life, you know. That's transcendent, I believe.
I know, Daniel, that you have something you want to say. I just want to share
No,
one thing
no.
because
That's just
my
my
job
face.
is to moderate.
No, I have a face that says I want to say something, but I actually
Oh,
can't,
really?
so carry on.
Okay. All right. Many of you may have seen the remarkable story of George Moses Horton, poet. This is written and illustrated by Don Tate. This is an incredible story. In a lot of ways, it's published by Peachtree, just, an Atlanta publisher. But I want to read to you the first part of the author's note. When I first began illustrating children's books, I decided that I would not work on stories about slavery. I had many reasons, one being that I wanted to focus on contemporary stories relevant to young readers today. In all honesty, though, what I wasn't admitting to myself was that I was ashamed of the topic. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest in the 1970s and 80s, which means he's significantly younger than I am. And at school, I was usually the only brown face in a sea of white. It seemed to me, whenever the topic of Black history came up, it was always in relationship to slavery, about how Black people were once the property of white people, no more human than a horse or a wheelbarrow. Sometimes white kids snickered and made jokes about the topic. Sometimes Black kids did too. It is difficult to talk about anything that makes us more vulnerable than we are today. And there are people who around the world now and in history were more vulnerable than any human being should ever be, and other things. And in thinking about those items and in helping people to make considerate choices of their audience, I want to remind you that in the 1970s, 10 Quick Ways to Analyze Children's Books for Racism and Sexism was published. It was a little pamphlet looking at how we address issues of diversity and other things. And that in 2013, just a couple of years ago, it was updated and looked at and expanded some of the biases that you might want to use and or talk about with all kinds of people who are listening and reading and looking at your stories, and it becomes a reality. One of the things that I think is most important is a quote that I stumbled upon, and I don't know what the source is, but I was able to Google it and other things. This idea of I am. I am, two of the most powerful words for what you put after them shapes your reality. This whole idea of I am. We don't know who the people are who are reading all of the different books. But we do, and I agree with you, Daniel, that I wish we were not having this conversation, and I wish we had moved forward and that the CCBC numbers for diversity in children's books and in our entire world, let's us not forget that a young girl was attacked, as far as I'm concerned, in the classroom last week, and that video went viral. So we can't ignore that this is a much bigger thing than here in children's books. That we can't always anticipate the reactions and or the items, and that people, hopefully, in as best good faith as they can, try to do the best they can with the knowledge and the access that they have. In thinking about that and looking at where we are today, and then making us the most vulnerable, what advice do you have for people who are sharing books and all kinds of things? I know, for instance, Sean, you have a forthcoming book with Scholastic, Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass, Two Friends, written by Dean Robbins, illustrated by both you and your lovely wife Selena as well. But what's some advice that you have for people as we navigate this discussion? And all of you have had all kinds of fabulous discussions with kids, or young people or kids or other things like that. So what's some advice that you have?
Shoot. I thought you were going to ask something different, so I prepared.
Okay, do you want me to change? I can change what
No,
I
I'll
was
just
going to
answer
ask.
that question. I'll pretend that you asked that.
Okay, fine.
Okay. No, it's a great question, though. Well, they're related because I think of it in terms of the same question applies to writers and artists who are trying to write, people who aren't us, right? Which is usually the question that comes up on a lot of panels like this is like, how do we do it? And there is, of course, no answer. It's always going to be different. It's always going to change. But I've written a lot about it, and I've taught a lot about it, and I think two of the most important things, and I think this really does apply to how you share with other people too, are about being really clear on the way that we protect ourselves in the sense of, to use myself as an example, when I'm writing female characters or non-male characters, I always have to think about how will my own male shit get in the way of me writing them appropriately and honestly?
Because you do write that female. You do write a lot of female.
I write a lot of
voice.
female characters, and I've written trans characters, and cis straight men, especially.
Cisgender is I identify with the sex that I was born in, versus transgender, which is I identify with the sex that I was not born in.
We have a history of violence, I think you could say, and for me not to be aware of what that means, and regardless of who I am as Daniel, an individual, how I affect other people by my presence and what that might mean, what history and memories other people bring to the table, is a way that I can pretend that everything is just cool. Similar with being a Latino who's not black, right? A brown-skinned Latino, very light, who sometimes passes and sometimes doesn't, who lives in this very complicated crossroads, as most people do on some level, of identity. So there's many ways that I can move forward and sort of cover up all those ways that I win and that I have a step up in life and in society in certain ways. Because it's easy not to talk about colorism in Latino communities. It's easy not to talk about sexism because that's what books have been doing forever. Books usually don't try to, especially fantasy, they don't want to tackle those more uncomfortable conversations. So in writing a book that is featuring a strong black female character in a Latino community, it was then my challenge to be honest about the fact that we do deal with a lot of anti-blackness and colorism in Latino communities. But still, and this kind of goes back to what I was initially saying, is how do we do this and still make it a love letter? Because I love my people. And I will not let you tell me that all my people are this one way. But I will be honest about who my people are. And that's really the challenge. And the question is, can we hold those two things at the same time? And they're really not two things, right? They're really thousands of things. And then can we tell a good story in the thick of it?
And I think we are running out of time, but I do want to give Sean and Sophie a chance to say anything that they might be interested in saying if they are on this topic. This whole idea, how do we move forward, or what's some advice that you have? As I know that we're all navigating some of these questions and looking to do the best that we can to create a world where we affirm life and humanity, period, regardless of the characteristics.
I think that's such a great thought, that it should be about moving forward, and it should be about affirming, and it should be about finding ways that we can have different opinions on things, but those opinions can coexist. I'm hearing that we should include diverse characters in everything, that there should be a gay character and a trans character and people of all different colors in our books. And then other people are saying, but then that kind of makes for a homogenous thing, and we should only write what we care about. And other people are saying, but you should include all of these people, and other people are saying, but you can't write outside your own experience. So there are a lot of really conflicting, contradictory ideas swirling around. And it's getting very heated online. I don't know if any of you have followed any of this. It's getting heated and at times deafening. And I don't know if any of you have ever had a marital argument. Probably not. Yes, probably not. No. But sometimes when you're in the heat of an argument with the person you love most in the world, it's impossible to remember that you love them most in the world. I just can't believe you would say that. And I think hopefully most of us in those relationships will eventually step back and go, oh yes, but that's true, I do love you, and yes, basically we want the same things. And I think that's something that we have the potential to lose sight of, and it terrifies me that and I said this to Daniel before we even started talking, and he looked at me a little bit like, not sure that we do, but I said, I think we want the same things, and he thought I meant, about this book. We can absolutely disagree about this book, but I think we want the same things, that we want good books for children, we want children to have good books, and we want children to have a really wide range of diverse books with diverse characters and choices that show things from all different points of view.
And we're going to end on you, Sean.
Okay.
No pressure.
Thank you.
I don't think there's a right way. I think we have to be honest. I think personal experience first and foremost. You know, Sophie's subway poster, I love it. Would be different than Daniel's subway poster at the Illustrated, and I know that for a fact.
I can't draw that one.
Just in terms of who you put in, who you notice on a train, would be very different than mine. When I look at it, I see honesty. In everyone's personal experience, their honesty is going to be different. You know, honestly, I take pride in seeing African Americans represented in this book. They're taking pride in who they are and what they're doing, you know, despite the situation. And I believe that was true of some people, of many people most likely. So yeah, you know, it's different for everyone. There's no one right way. You know, be true to your personal experience. And you know, for me, you know, I love representing really dark-skinned people because I didn't see them in books, and I still don't. You know, someone else may not, but that's my thing. So, and I'm the person, you know, like, okay, dark-skinned people, you know, and the emotion, call Sean, you know, that's me, and I'm proud of that. And within that, you know, I realized, oh, I've been doing kind of the same thing for a while. I need to expand, you know, change up some of the skin tones. Yeah, and if there were prescriptions to follow, things would suck. You know, things would suck. Okay, I'm writing about a person of color. It says I should, okay, call 3 African Americans, you know, check with some Latinos. Do I have a transgender friend? I don't know, you know, it would suck. You gotta bring your personal experience. And if there's a problem with it, someone says something, okay, it's a conversation. Have the conversation, you know. The conversation, I don't regret having this conversation. I've been waiting to have this conversation for a long time, you know. So many people don't want to talk about race. The UPS guy's like, oh, you know, your kids aren't happy in your books. I'm like, let's talk about it. There's things, you know. Let's talk about it. Don't just say they're not happy. There's a reason why they're not happy. I want the honest conversation, and if that book inspired it, kudos to you guys. And you know, I know you're coming from a sincere place. You've always included people of color. And I mean, like, look at the skin tones. You know, it's like you feel it, you know? It's like, I appreciate that.
Jackie Woodson told me that when I just started illustrating.
Right.
She said there are all different kinds of brown. And it's so obvious,
Yeah.
but when you're using watercolors and you know, and you're sort of, well, this is my palette. It's
Well, I've got a bias too. You
such
look
a
at my browns,
fantastic-
they're all kind of similar.
I love this. I love conversation period, which too many people in the room know. But I want to
just
thank.
raise my
Thank
second
you. I
full
want to
bowl
thank
of
you.
water to
You're very
Susannah
silly.
Richards, ladies and
Very
gentlemen.
silly. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for your honesty, your vulnerability, and thank you for hopefully moving us forward. There are a few resources that I put in my slides for those of you who are looking, whether it's reading while white, whether it's images, looking for we need diverse books, all kinds of things. Children are not colorblind, how young children learn race and other things. There are really good resources out there, and I hope that you are able to find the books that are the windows, mirrors, and doors for your constituencies here and into the future, and I hope that those change. So thank you very much, and have a good day.
Do you have a link on the
I
lip
will
guide?
put them. I will send them to the powers that be.
You'll put it on the lip guide?
Put it on the lip guide.
You'll put it on the lip guide?
Okay.
I think you are all studying.